"This is how we die, Captain Granick," muttered, all four of his eyes locked onto the horror before him. It clung to the ceiling of the command center, unmoving, its 8 spindly legs gripped the metal surface with impossible precision. Its tiny segmented body remained idly still, its beady soulless eyes reflected the dim glow of the ship's emergency lighting. A spider, not a towering fanged beast, not a genetically engineered Earth predator, released to hunt them down, just a single tiny house spider. And yet to the Jiran, a species known across the sector for their incredible technological advancements and impressive interstellar expansion, it was nothing short of an existential nightmare. "Captain, permission to open fire," one of the officers whispered, his tendrils twitching with terror. Granick didn't respond. His mind was racing. There was no protocol for this, none. Their species had mapped out war strategies against every major galactic civilization. They had prepared for the day they would face humanity in open battle. Their weapons were primed to wipe out the species that had time and time again proven itself far too dangerous to be left unchecked. But this was not war, this was horror. The first encounter between Jiran and human forces had ended in disaster. The Jiran had assumed humanity was just another warm-blooded, fleshy race that would crumble under superior firepower. Instead, humans had fought like nothing the Jiran had ever seen. They were fast, unpredictable, and worst of all, fearless. Jiran warriors, conditioned to value survival above all else, were no match for human soldiers who threw themselves into combat with reckless abandon. The war should have ended then. Humanity should have chased them across the stars, burning their colonies to the ground. But strangely, they had not. Humans had called it a regional conflict, not worth the effort of a full-scale invasion. They let the Girvan retreat, content to leave them licking their wounds. So the Girvan had done the only thing that made sense. They had run far across space, deep into the void, to establish a hidden colony where no human would ever set foot until now. The spider shifted slightly, its tiny legs adjusting their grip. The movement sent a ripple of fear through the gathered Jirvan officers. "Sir, I strongly advise immediate evacuation of the colony," another officer stammered. Grans clenched his mandibles. This had to be some kind of psychological warfare. Humanity had found their hiding place, and instead of sending an army, had unleashed this horror upon them. It was a message: we don't even need to fight you. We know your fear, we can destroy you. With a single insignificant creature, he could see the panic growing. If the officers broke, the rest of the colony would follow. If word spread, it would be chaos. "Hold your ground," Granzak ordered, though his own voice wavered. "It is a creature, just a creature. We are Jiran. We do not surrender to things." Nobody looked convinced. "We should call for human assistance," someone muttered. That sent a fresh wave of discomfort through the room. "Call the humans the enemy, the very species they had fled from." And yet the suggestion had merit. Humans did not fear these creatures. They lived with them in their homes willingly. Garks swallowed hard open a channel to the humans. A few agonizing minutes later, the human response came through a video feed flickered to life, revealing the face of a bearded man in a wrinkled uniform. He looked at them with tired, unimpressed eyes. "This is Lieutenant Harris of the Terran Outreach Division," he grumbled. "You called for assistance." Greenwich stepped forward. We have a situation." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "There is a presence aboard our command ship, an intruder." Harris straightened slightly. "Human forces, a rogue faction, pirates." Granick hesitated. There was no way to say this without humiliation. A spider silence. Then Harris burst out laughing. Zach's mandibles clicked in frustration. "This is not a joke. It is inside the command center." Harris wiped his eyes, still chuckling. "Let me get this straight. Your species started a war with us. You fought, lost, ran off to some hidden corner of space. And now, after all of that, you're calling us because of a spider." Granzak's exoskeleton tensed. "We have cultural sensitivities." "Yeah," Harris said, still smirking. "We know." He leaned back in his chair. "Look, we could send someone, and hear me out, you could just," he waved a hand in the air, "smack it." That suggestion sent a ripple of horrified murmurs through the Javan. "That is an unacceptable risk," Greenwich said stiffly. Harris sighed. All right, right, fine. Give me the coordinates. I'll come deal with your bug problem. It is not a bug, Greenwich. Shouted Harris, grinned. Yeah. Whatever, sit tight. The feed cut off. The command center remained frozen in uneasy silence. Sir, an officer finally spoke. Voice barely above a whisper. What if the human fails? Grenzak didn't answer. The thought had already crossed his mind. Because if a human, a creature capable of facing death without hesitation, was no match for the thing lurking on their ceiling, then perhaps the John had already lost. The John command center remained locked in tense silence, every officer keeping their gaze fixed on the monstrous intruder gripping the ceiling. Nobody moved, nobody even breathed too loudly. The horror was still. Their legs splayed in a grotesque waiting posture. It had not descended yet, but that only made things worse. The uncertainty was unbearable. Grenzak's claws twitched anxiously as he checked the time. The human had said he was coming, but how long did it take one of their vessels to arrive? The Gervin fleet had fled to the most remote sector they could find, specifically to avoid human contact. If they had made a mistake in their calculations, if Harris had underestimated the distance, Captain, one of the officers whispered urgently, his tendrils coiling in distress. It's moving. Grenzak's gaze snapped upward. The spider had shifted again, slowly, deliberately. One of its hideous legs twitched, adjusting itself. Another leg followed, then, without warning, it dropped a few inches. The reaction was immediate. Half the Jurin in the room bolted for the exit, scrambling over consoles and diving for the door in a desperate attempt to escape. Greenwich himself nearly lost his balance as his instinct to run clashed with his thin grasp on discipline. The security details, supposedly the most composed warriors in the fleet, had pressed themselves against the walls, trembling. The spider hung there, now suspended by an impossibly thin thread of silk dangling in a slow, stomach-turning sway. It was descending closer. A faint, high-pitched sound filled the air. It took Grenzak a moment to realize it was coming from him. The doors to the command center suddenly hissed open. Every remaining officer turned, expecting reinforcements, but what they saw was somehow worse. A human had arrived. Harris stood there in the doorway, helmet tucked under one arm, chewing something lazily. He took in the scene with a single raised eyebrow. All right, he said, voice slow, casual. Where's the little guy? One trembling officer raised a claw and pointed straight up. Harris followed the gesture and smirked. Oh, that's just a little house spider, he said. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. Granz couldn't process the absurdity of the statement. Harris strode in completely unconcerned, rolling his shoulders, like this was a routine maintenance check, instead of a life-threatening encounter with one of the most horrifying creatures in the universe. The Gervin clung to the walls, watching in stunned silence as Harris walked right beneath the dangling nightmare. He reached up, completely fearless, and he plucked the spider from its thread with 2 fingers. Grenzak nearly blacked out. The human was holding it with his bare hand. Harris glanced down at the tiny creature, tilting his head slightly. Man, you guys really freak out over these, huh? Nobody responded. The Javan had seen human soldiers wade through plasma fire. Without flinching, they had seen them tear through battlefields with nothing but crude weapons and sheer audacity. They had even seen them survive wounds that should have been fatal to any other species, but this was something else entirely. Harris casually walked toward the nearest console, idly inspecting the spider as he moved. He continued, these things are actually kind of useful. Back on Earth, they eat pests, keep other bugs out. People just let them hang around. Granz couldn't stop his mandibles from clacking in sheer disbelief. You coexist with them, Harris shrugged. Yeah, why not? A horrified murmur swept through the remaining Juran. This wasn't just a human tactic. This wasn't some exaggerated display of bravado. Humans actually lived alongside these creatures. They didn't just tolerate them. They accepted them. They let them exist in their homes. A new, deeply unsettling thought crept into Greenwich's mind. If humans could be this indifferent to something as objectively terrifying as a spider, then what else did they consider harmless? What nightmares lurked in their world? that they barely acknowledged Harris. Glanced around, clearly amused by their distress. "All right, so do you want me to get rid of it, or what?" "Yes," Granich said. Immediately dispose of it. "However you see fit." Harris gave him a sideways look before turning toward the exit. All right, no need to be dramatic," with an exaggerated casualness. He walked out, whistling to himself, the spider still in his grasp. The door hissed shut behind him for a long time. Nobody moved. Then, without a word, one of the officers pulled up a colony-wide announcement in her face. "Send a priority alert," he murmured. "Tell everyone to begin emergency evacuation procedures." Grand Zack barely had the strength to nod. They had thought they had escaped the humans. They had thought they had put enough distance between themselves and Earth to finally live in peace, but they had been wrong. If the humans could live alongside such horrors without fear, if they could endure what the Geron could not, then they were not just a warlike species. They were something worse, something unknowable, something truly unstoppable. And there was only one thing left to do. They had to run again, farther this time. Somewhere no human would ever follow. Somewhere safe, if such a place even existed. The evacuation was already underway. Grandex stood rigid at the command console, staring at the chaos unfolding across the colony. Security feeds displayed Geron civilians scrambling through the corridors, loading their few essential belongings onto transport shuttles. Entire city sectors were being abandoned in record time. Engineers had begun deactivating power grids, wiping computer cores, and setting demolition charges on key structures to ensure nothing was left behind for the humans to study. "Sir," an officer said, voice tight with barely contained panic, "we've calculated a full evacuation in 6 hours. Unacceptable," Grandex snapped. "Accelerate the process." "But Captain, do it." The officer hesitated only a moment before nodding and relaying the order. Grand Zack's claws tapped restlessly against the console. This was not a battle, not in any conventional sense. There had been no orbital bombardment, no fleet engagement, no armies had clashed, and yet the Hum had already won that one. Human Harris had dismantled the Gervin colony's resolve without firing a single shot. He had not threatened them, he had not demanded surrender, he had simply arrived, removed the nightmare, and walked away. And now the Geron were fleeing for their lives. The implications were horrifying. "Captain," another officer called communications from multiple civilian leaders. "Ignore them," Granich said sharply. "Just make sure they get to the transport, sir. They want to know why we are leaving." Granich clenched his mandibles. "They do not need to know." The officer hesitated. "Captain, with all due respect, do we?" Granich exhaled slowly. "We know enough." That was the truth. There was no logic behind this anymore. Logic dictated they could stay, that there was no immediate threat, that humans did not even care about their colony, let alone intend to pursue them. But none of that mattered. The Geron were a pragmatic species. They did not fight losing battles. They did not engage in pointless resistance. And when confronted with an opponent so terrifyingly alien in their indifference to what should be a universal fear, they did the only thing that made sense. They ran. A sudden alert blared through the command center, making several officers flinch. Grand Zack turned sharply toward the nearest screen. "Proximity alarm." "Yes, sir," an officer confirmed her, pulling up the sensor data. "One incoming vessel approaching at sublight speed." "Humans?" "Yes, sir." The command center tensed. Grand Zack felt a strange mix of dread and resignation settle over him. Of course, they were coming back. The question was why. "Put them on screen." He ordered. The central monitor flickered to life, revealing the familiar tired face of Lieutenant Harris. He looked vaguely annoyed. "All right," Harris said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I was halfway back to my ship when I picked up some weird signals coming from your colony. Looks like you're evacuating." Silence. Grand Zack fought the urge to shift uncomfortably. Harris blinked. "Is this about the spider?" More silence. Then slowly the human exhaled, shaking his head. "Okay, look, I really need you guys to explain something to me." Because right now it looks like an entire advanced alien civilization is abandoning their home because of one tiny house spider. Greenwich remained still. We do not discuss our cultural matters with outsiders. Harris threw up his hands. Cultural, okay, fine, sure you guys are afraid of spiders, whatever, but you realize it's gone now, right? Gerzak's mandibles twitched. You removed one. Harris frowned. Yeah, that's how it works. You removed one. Greenwich repeated more firmly. One that was visible. But how can you be certain there are not more? Harris stared at him. Wait, are you saying you think there are more spiders here in your colony? We cannot take that risk. Harris let out a strangled laugh. You think what that Earth spiders have somehow infiltrated your secret alien colony that they're hiding? Grand said nothing. The human's expression shifted from amusement to disbelief. Oh, you're serious? We have no way of knowing the full extent of the infestation. Grant explained. If one was here, more could be lurking, waiting. Harris ran a hand down his face. You guys think spiders are some kind of invasive species? We know they are an invasive species. They have successfully coexisted with humans. Humans who have adapted to even the harshest environments. It stands to reason that any species he's capable of enduring alongside them is equally unrelenting. Harris muttered something under his breath, then leaned closer to the screen. Captain, listen to me. Spiders do not follow us around. They do not spread between planets. That one was probably just an accident. Maybe it got into a supply shipment or something, but I can promise you there is no infestation. Granick held his gaze. We cannot be sure of that. Harris groaned. All right. What do you want me to do? Search your entire colony for spiders? How big is this place anyway? 3 planetary sectors. An officer murmured. Harris let out a slow, exasperated sigh. Okay, he said. New plan. I leave you stay, and everything goes back to normal. That is not an option. Grand Zach said firmly. You do not understand what we are dealing with. Harris rubbed his temples. I literally just held it in my hand. Exactly. Grand Zach said darkly. That is why we are leaving for the first time since the conversation started. Harris hesitated. He studied Greenwich closely, then glanced at the other officers, all of whom were still tense, still staring at the screen like their lives depended on it. Slowly Harris sat back in his chair. You guys really are serious about this? He muttered. Yes. A long silence stretched between them. Finally Harris let out a long breath. All right, look, I'm not going to stop you, but I am going to have to report this back to my superiors. Grant stiffened. Why? Because this is insane. Harris said flatly. An entire alien colony is fleeing because of a spider. Do you have any idea how this is going to sound when I write my report? Granick didn't respond. Harris sighed. Whatever, do what you want, but if you ever settle somewhere else and need me to remove another spider, let me know. The screen flickered off. Grans turned back toward his officers. Proceed with the evacuation. Nobody questioned the order. The evacuation proceeded at full speed. Across the colony, entire districts were shut down, automated systems rerouted, and infrastructure abandoned. The Gerben, a species that had once prided themselves on their unshakable logic and foresight, now moved with pure instinct. The only goal was to escape. Grandak stood at the main viewport of the command ship, watching as transport vessels launched in steady waves, disappearing into the void. The colony would be empty soon. It had taken years to build, yet it would be deserted in mere hours, and all because of one tiny Earth creature. Final transports are ready, Captain. An officer reported. We have clearance to depart. Grand Zach nodded. Initiate launch sequence. Engines roared to life beneath them. The ship's artificial gravity adjusted as they lifted off, breaking free of the atmosphere. In minutes, the colony below was nothing more than a shrinking blur. On the planet's surface, one of the officers shifted nervously. Should we destroy the colony before we go to ensure none of them remain? Grandek considered it. Normally protocol demanded that no trace of Gervan habitation be left behind, but there was no need. No human would settle here. No army would invade. The place was tainted now, infested. Even if it had been a single creature, they could never be certain it was truly gone, and so it was best left Behind abandoned to whatever horrors lurked unseen. No, he said at last. It is already lost. The officer nodded and relayed the order. No weapons would fire. No self-destruction codes would be triggered. They were simply leaving as the Fleet F adjusted its trajectory, preparing to enter deep space travel. And alert chimed at the command console. Gran Zach turned to see a final transmission request from the human vessel still in orbit. Harris Gran Zach hesitated, then motioned for the call to be accepted. The human's face flickered onto the screen. Once more, so Harris said, crossing his arms. That's it, you're just gone. Gran Zach inclined his head. We have no reason to remain. Harris sighed, shaking his head. You're really running from a spider. Grans exhaled. It is not the creature itself. It is what it represents. Harris frowned. And what exactly does it represent? Gerzak's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Humanity. The room was silent. Even the officers nearby glanced at the screen, watching for the human's reaction. Harris tilted his head. You're saying we remind you of SP spiders? No, Granish said. We do not fear the spider because it is dangerous. We fear it because it is something we cannot understand, something that defies every instinct we possess. It exists where it should not. It survives where it should fail, and your kind embraces it. Without hesitation, he narrowed his eyes slightly. You are a species that looks at a nightmare and calls it harmless. That is what makes you dangerous. Harris let out a breath, running a hand down his face. Man, you guys are weird. Gran Zach said nothing. Harris shook his head. All right, well, safe travels, I guess. He leaned forward slightly. But if you ever change your minds and want to make peace with us instead of running, maybe don't start with the whole fighting humans thing next time. Grans gave the slightest nod. Duly noted. The screen flickered off. Entering deep space. Transition in 30 seconds. An officer reported. Grans turned his attention forward. A vast starfield stretched before them, endless unknown. They would have to find another home, one far beyond the reach of humans. He only hoped it would be far enough, because now he understood something terrifying about their former enemies. Humans did not conquer with brute force alone. They conquered with their ability to look at something horrifying and shrug. The ship jolted as they entered. Faster than light travel, the Gervin fleet vanished into the darkness of space, and behind them, on the now empty planet, the lone human ship remained in orbit. Inside, Lieutenant Harris reclined in his chair, muttering to himself as he typed up his report. Alien evacuation caused by single housey spider. Recommend further research into Gerin psychology, potential psychological warfare applications. He smirked to himself and hit sin. Somewhere in the abandoned depth of the Gerin colony, the last spider still lurked, and it had won a war without ever knowing